And so I had a pretty healthy fear of my parents finding out a lot of things.
Mhm.
Plus, I was very driven for some reason. So I was always had projects and things like that. But I do have a few stories.
Okay, well, we need one. Can we have one?
I don't think so.
Oh,
I'm pretty sure my parents would still.
Hey, Empowered Vegan Lifers, Ella here with my co-host. Hey, Stephanie.
Hey, Ella. How are you?
I am doing well. I'm really excited about today's episode, which we will get to shortly. But I did want to touch on the picture I sent you the other day. Can we touch on that?
Let's do it. Yes, I need to know more about this.
So for those listening right now, my friend sent me a really old picture. It was obviously, what's it called when it's not digital? I think a hard copy.
Not digital.
It was like, the real picture. Like we don't have those anymore.
No, we don't.
Which is sad.
It's very sad. I agree.
Anyway, he had taken a picture on the phone of the actual picture and sent it to me. And it was us in high school. This was, I think, our senior year spring break. And me and my friends went to Nassau, to the Bahamas.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And they were having the MTV spring break show party there. And they had wrestling. So they had pro wrestlers, and they had a wrestling show outside on the beach. And I think I made my way up front because I don't know who that wrestler is. I think he's pretty famous. But so the picture is of me and the wrestler kind of hugging, sticking our tongues out because he's got a tongue piercing. And I don't know if you zoomed in, Stephanie, had to.
Most certainly did. I had to see the tongue piercings.
Yeah. So the story behind the tongue piercings is that I got my tongue pierced when I was 16 or so. And then some other people started getting their tongue pierced at school. And it really pissed me off because I liked being the first one to get the tongue piercing. And so rebel me was like, well, fine, I'm getting two. So I went back to the place and said, okay, I want a second one. Well, guess what happened on the second one? He hit a vein. He hit a vein. So I'm like spurting blood because I had to have two.
Right.
Yep. And so I had to let that heal. And what did I do?
Let it close.
No. Yes, I did. And then I did it again.
Oh, gosh.
Yes. That's why that picture has two tongue piercings.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of things you do when you're 16.
Oh, boy. Do you have any memories of 16? Anything stand out for you?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, we have to hear this.
And I have to tell you that I'm very happy there was no social media around at the time, because then I can keep them all to myself.
Until you have a podcast, and I'm going to say you've got to tell the world right now.
To tell the world the whole thing. Actually, I was a relatively calm teenager. I had I lived in a very, very small town. And so I had a pretty healthy fear of my parents finding out a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I didn't do a whole lot. Plus, I was very driven for some reason. So I was always had projects and things like that. But I do have a few stories.
Okay, well, we need one. Can we have one?
I don't think so.
Oh,
I'm pretty sure my parents would still. I'm still carrying that healthy fear of.
That makes me laugh. That's so cute.
Yeah.
All right. Well, now I'm not going to forget this. So you're going to have to tell me in private, and then I'm going to have to then convince you on the next episode for you to tell the world. We will have to have a coaching session around your fear.
My fear of my parents finding out about things that I did 20 some years, 30 some years ago.
Yes,
yeah.
I think we're going to have to work on this a little bit.
Probably so. Yeah.
Fun.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yes. All right. Well, shall we get to this episode?
Let's do it.
Okay. Well, let me tell you guys a little bit about Simon. Here we go. Simon Hill is a physiotherapist and nutritionist who is passionate about making nutritional information simple and accessible so that people can make informed decisions about the food they feed themselves and their family. In 2008, Simon completed a Bachelor of Physiotherapy and immediately began working as a sports physiotherapist, both at a leading private practice and with professional footballers. Over the years, however, Simon became increasingly curious about the role nutrition played in nourishing the body and preventing disease. Simon shifted gears in his career, undertaking a plant-based nutrition certificate and a postgraduate degree in nutrition. He set up plantproof.com and began hosting world-renowned doctors and public figures. Over the course of the past decade, Simon's mission has become clearer and clearer. Most of the time, nutrition is spoken about in isolation from other major world issues, despite an enormous degree of interconnectedness. Just as our food system is a human health issue, it is also a human and animal rights issue. Just as climate change is a planetary health issue, it is a human rights issue. Through the plant-proof channels, Simon's hope is that more of us will work together to create a more equitable, beautiful, and peaceful world. Something we are proud of today and something future generations continue to enjoy. And this starts with becoming more connected, more informed, more mindful, and more conscious. Let's get to it. Simon, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Ella. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, I've been a fan for quite a while, so I'm pretty excited.
Well, we're doing this, and hopefully we add some value for your listeners. I think we can do that.
I think we can manage that. But I would like to start off, if you don't mind, with a little sprint round just for fun.
Mm-hmm. Let's do it.
Okay, got 5 questions. We'll start with the easy ones. All right, Simon, tofu, tempeh, or edamame?
Tempeh.
One food you could eat every day for the rest of your life?
Avocado.
What non-human animal do you share the most qualities with?
Goats.
Goats? Yes, I can't wait to hear about this. Okay. Name one thing on your bucket list.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, we were just speaking about Miami, so let me put that on there. That's an easy one.
Deal.
And Costa Rica. I'd love to get down to Costa Rica, and I've heard amazing things about the community down there. So that's definitely on the list as well.
Yes, I kind of have this dream about moving there, like to the beach. And as long as I have internet, right? Like we can kind of work from anywhere. So,
yeah.
Okay. Anyway, last one. One random talent or quirk that maybe people don't know about.
Oh, gosh, that's a good one. I was excelling at very advanced mathematics. And when I was in year 7, I had started university mathematics. So a little bit of a math whiz, but I may have lost some of that over the years.
Wait, when you were like 7th grade or 7th?
Yeah, when I was in 7th grade, I was doing university maths.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. What kind of math did you like? Did you have like one that you like geometry or?
I did like geometry, algebra. Yeah, you're throwing me into the deep end here, but it was a mix of all of that stuff.
It was interesting. I was just watching an episode. Have you ever heard of Gaia TV?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. So I was watching some show on sacred geometry.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about the dodecahedron. And I'm like, I don't know if I've ever said that word before in my life. It was just super fascinating, some of the sacred geometry. Have you studied that at all?
Yeah, I did get into geometry. I'm not sure that I really dove right into sacred geometry. But I must say I was obsessed with mathematics, and it is one of those things you kind of use it or lose it. So it would be interesting to see how I'd go these days. It's been some time since I was in those textbooks, that's for sure.
All right. Well, let's get to what you're an expert at now, and that's nutrition. How did this passion for nutrition come about?
Yeah, sure. So I have a master's in nutrition science, and I guess I spend most of my time now trolling through all of the various studies that come out looking at human health and nutrition and trying to make sense of them in a what is a very confusing area of science. And as you're well aware, becomes super confusing for the layperson who sees, changing headlines and various polarizing opinions on social media. For me, the initial kind of inspiration goes back to when I was a child, and I saw for the first time what loss of health looks like. And I think up until that point, I kind of just assumed that we lived healthy lives and, we would all become grandparents and happy days. And that was my experience, because up until that point in time, I'd never seen anyone in my family die or be diagnosed with anything significant. And so on this particular day, I was with my dad, it's just he and I, and he had a severe heart attack in front of me, and it ended up him being flown by helicopter. The paramedics coming, we were in a remote location and taking him to the nearest hospital, and I couldn't fit in the helicopter, so sort of trailed in an ambulance by road. And that was, of course, a very frightening thing to experience for anyone, but let alone a 15-year-old who really, I couldn't make sense of it, because my dad was only 41. He was, for all intents and purposes, very healthy. He wasn't reliant on the healthcare system. He wasn't taking any medications. So it was really all, out of the blue. And, it was a long wait at the hospital. And by that time, my mother and brother, who were elsewhere, they had come to the hospital too. And, my dad was very lucky because, unlike many people who have a severe heart attack who actually die within an hour of their very first symptoms, that's called sudden cardiac death. It's the leading cause of cardiovascular disease to this day, which is people without a diagnosis, out of nowhere, experiencing a heart attack, and in an hour they're dead. And he got a second chance at life. They saved his life. They told us that he would be on medications for the remainder of his life. But the most important thing to us was that he was still living and breathing. And, for that, we were very grateful. And for the healthcare, level of healthcare in Australia is phenomenal. So we're, of course, super privileged to have access to that, which I didn't really realize at the time, but is now something that I'm much more aware of. But the sort of, the aftermath of that was a discussion with the cardiologist, and they had taken my family history. And my grandfather had also had a heart attack. My grandmother had vascular dementia. So another disease affecting blood vessels. And so their advice to my brother and I, my brother was 18, I was 15, was that we're nearly, young men. And this is something that we need to watch very closely, be screened, and that cardiovascular disease runs in families. And so that was the kind of extent of the conversation. And, that advice on its own is good advice. It's good if you do have a family history of something to definitely be aware of it. But I do wish the conversation had have spanned and gone a little bit further.
So they didn't really talk about what actions you needed to take or stop taking to prevent this from happening to you?
No. So there was no discussion around, why this happened to my father at age 41. The sort of insinuation was that, these diseases happen, and this is kind of the genetic card that our family has been dealt. And so for many years after that, both my brother and I were living, I guess, with a sort of disempowerment. What was to say that we wouldn't just follow in the same footsteps as our dad, given that he was, representative of the typical Australian that was living the normal Australian lifestyle, same as us. Why would it be any different for us? So it was very disempowering. And when I was in my mid-20s, I was motivated. My first degree I did was in physiotherapy, and I was working with athletes and professional athletes in Australia. And I had started to become very interested in nutrition. I felt like it was a big gap for me in terms of I had a very surface level understanding, macronutrients and calories and protein obsessed. And I felt like there was a big gap in these football club environments. And I was also very inspired by my brother who sort of pushed me in the direction of looking at science a little closer. He had come across some information that spoke to what we were just sort of alluding to, that there is a lot you can do even if you have been dealt a bad genetic card in terms of your lifestyle to lower your risk of cardiovascular disease and other chronic diseases that we have accepted and normalized in our societies. And I started trying to go into the various scientific papers, and I was listening to a lot of different experts out there, and even with the first degree that I had done, which was a science degree, and there was a lot of physiology and biochemistry, and I actually did my own clinical study and wrote up a thesis paper. So I had experience with research, but still nutrition science was a very different field of science. And it was very challenging for me to make sense of things. So I realized I needed to go back to university. And that was when I enrolled and did a master's in nutrition science, and became sort of healthfully obsessed with going through that literature. And, the end product of that was moving from this state of feeling disempowered to empowered, and realizing that, by and large, these diseases that are running in our families are yes, there can be a genetic component, but they're running in our families because everyone in our families are adopting the same lifestyles. And, that left me sort of getting to this point where you flip the script and you realize, how much more control you have. And of course, that was something I wanted to share with my family and friends, and then through Plant Proof to a wider community.
Wow, that's such a powerful story. And I love, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on this show is because you talk about empowerment so much and helping people you're not so much telling people what to eat, you're giving people the information so they can make a conscious and mindful choice about what they put in their bodies, what they give to their children, their families. So what you're talking about essentially is epigenetics, right?
Yes. So you can, have these gene variants that are predisposing you to a certain disease. Like in my family, I no doubt have certain genes that are likely predisposing me to cardiovascular disease. And the cool thing is, we know from studies of identical twins, for example, you can take two people with the exact same genes, and those people go and live in different environments. This allows you, through science, to test nature versus nurture. And what we can see is that while the genes definitely do play a role, they probably have about 20% of the say when it comes to what our health fate is. Whereas the environment and the way that we navigate through life, the choices that we make every day are affecting about 80% of that health fate outcome. So we have, 4 more times control than our genes do. And so we can understand that, and then use science to make those choices that sort of shift things back into our favor.
Right. So when you went to get your master's in nutrition, were you already plant-based at that point?
No, I wasn't. I was, initially I was inspired when I was inspired to look at the science through my brother. At that point in time, I was eating a very animal protein rich diet. And as I said, I was working in professional football club environment. I was surrounded by fitness culture. And so, the typical diet in that setting is, a large amounts of animal protein. It's the hero of the plate. And vegetables, if they're there at all, there's not a lot of diversity. It's probably broccoli,
I was gonna say broccoli.
some sweet potato and white rice.
Mm-hmm.
And so my diet overall was super rich in animal protein. It was rich in saturated fat and dietary cholesterol. It was low in fiber and low in plant diversity. And as I was, trying to make sense of the science, obviously I was being challenged a lot with what I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, when I set out to start going through the literature, I really wanted to find evidence to prove my brother wrong, because I wasn't coming from a position where I personally was experiencing loss of health or poor health. I actually felt really good. And this is quite normal for many people in their 20s. Our bodies are incredibly resilient. And, so that diet, in terms of my performance and how I felt, it was good. There was no reason for me to question it.
Right.
And so, as I was reading, the science and it was challenging me, then, I had all of those common questions that so many of us have, which is, okay, well, as I start to reduce animal protein in my diet, maybe that's the best thing for my long-term health and chronic disease, but what's that going to do to my performance? And am I still going to be able to pursue my athletic endeavors? And where will I get my protein and all that sort of stuff?
So I'm curious, for the nutrition program you did, was it pro plant-based, or did you have to kind of really dig in and figure out that information on your own? Because there's a lot of nutritionists out there that are not plant-based.
I would say that the course, it's an evidence-based course. So, the theme of eating, which is what I write about in my book, was there. They were very much, advocating for a diet that is low in saturated fat. It's rich in unsaturated fats. It's, of course, trying to completely avoid trans fats. It's low in ultra processed foods, and it's rich in fiber and plant protein. And, so of course, there could be little things within the course that you could zoom in on and perhaps not fully agree on. But I'd say that as I would zoom out, the majority of the information in the course is in line with the evidence. And, my position is that within that theme, there are a number of different diets that can get you there. It could be a really well done Mediterranean diet. It could be a really well done pescatarian diet. It could be a really well done vegetarian diet, or it could be a really well done vegan, whole food, plant-based diet. And I think that's consistent with the very best science that we have today on human health. And as I kind of write in the book, I think the case for leaning more towards a plant exclusive diet is really made stronger when you start to think about the effect that our food choices have on the world around us, on planetary health and non-human animals. So, when I think about it like that, and of course, the masters that I did is focusing on human health, I think they did a pretty good job at putting forward, a very evidence-based position for those that were going through the course.
Got it. So at what point did you say, okay, I've seen enough, I'm going plant-based and I'm very passionate about it?
It was a gradual process for me. I got to the point where I realized that given my family history, that and caring about my long-term health and really, when I was in my mid-20s, I was only 15 years away from the age that my dad had his heart attack. And if he wasn't so lucky to have had the helicopter and been flown to hospital that quickly, who's to know what the outcome could have been? So the motivation to consider my long-term health was very strong for me. And I'm aware of that because some people who are in their 20s today don't have that motivation because they haven't experienced that. And it's something I always try and come back to, is to remind people, let's not wait for pain. Don't wait for someone in your family to have the heart attack to then sort of kick you into gear. But for me, after I had all of the information and realized that I needed to dramatically cut down on animal protein, it was about making small changes. And so over a 6 to 9 month sort of process, I started dialing back on animal protein and adding in more of the, some of the foods you mentioned before, like tofu and tempeh and different types of beans, which really were new for me, other than, sometimes when we'd go to a Mexican restaurant, I wasn't eating a lot of beans. So it was actually quite exciting for me to try new foods and new recipes, and it kind of reinvigorated my love for food, rather than just eating the same thing 2-3 times a day with very little diversity. And I really had no set point as to where I was going to go and land. And I just kept making changes because I was feeling better. And that was what spoke to me. So again, I think we can have all the science we want in the world, but one of the most impactful things is once you start putting those recommendations into practice and you start feeling the benefits yourself. And so for me, what did that look like? Well, I was noticing I was having more energy throughout the day. So when it was 3, 4, 5, I didn't feel so sluggish after my lunch. I noticed even at dinner time, instead of having a huge piece of steak and feeling just completely lethargic and needing to lie down on the couch afterwards, I felt more energized. I noticed that I was sleeping better and I was waking up with more energy. Those were the biggest things that I noticed. As I said before, I wasn't an unhealthy kind of person, but to feel that, it really spoke to me on a deep level. It kind of emphasized that the changes that I was making were right, and that these were not only going to be, as the science shows, great for my long-term health, but could actually leave me feeling better in my day-to-day. And so it was that slow process of cutting down. Initially, I focused on red meat, and then I focused on chicken. And there was a stage there where I was doing a sort of pescatarian style diet. And I think this is a fairly common way for people to do it. And then ultimately, the decision for me to remove all animal products was a little bit to do with my personality, to be honest. And I've got a personality where sometimes I need to draw a line in the sand. And I knew that I was kind of sort of teetering around this diet without making any real commitments. And I could see it was a slippery slope where if I was trying to moderate and just keep small amounts in there and do plant predominant, for me, that wouldn't work. I would just go back, I would fall into my old habits. And so it got to a point where I just really wanted to make a commitment to myself to have that line in the sand. And I did that, and that's now been 6, nearly 7 years, and have continually felt better and better. And I certainly don't feel like I'm slowing down. I'll be 40 in a few years. And so it's all working out well.
I hear you. I turned 41 this year, and everybody was talking about once you hit 40, everything's going to slow down. Everything's going to change. Nothing's changed. I don't feel a day over 35, I think, at least. So don't be scared of 40, Simon. Be okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's talk a little bit about physique, though. A lot of people are worried, especially men that I speak with who are listening, about kind of reducing the animal protein, worrying about sacrificing the size. And can you talk to that a little and what you found works for you?
So two main things I usually talk to here. One is total calories and the other is protein. And these are the two things that I think are most important to address here. Total calories are important because if we're not eating enough calories and we are working out, it doesn't really matter what we're doing. We can start to lose weight, lose size. And for me, as one thing I did notice is that as I was eating more legumes and less red meat and other animal foods, I did lose a little bit of weight in the first sort of 3-4 months, and not intentionally. And in the current sort of obesogenic environment that we live in, this is one of the huge advantages of a plant-based dietary pattern, is that it does help many people fill up on less calories. However, if your goal is not to lose weight and is to stay the same weight or to gain weight, which is the goal of many people, probably the people you're talking about now, and certainly was for me and still is for me, you need to be conscious of calorie density. And so if you look at a typical animal-based meal that's 500 calories versus a plant-based meal that's 500 calories, that plant-based meal will take up much more of the plate. The food volume will be bigger, pending that it's not just all a vegetable oil. And what that means is that you do, as you're making the transition, you need to be mindful of that. So you are actually eating more volume. That's one thing. And the second is being mindful that within plant-based foods, there are low calorie density and high calorie density plant-based foods. So if you're finding that you are dropping a little bit of weight, or actually you're feeling that your energy levels are reducing, often this is because you're not eating enough calories. And so looking at the different calorie density of plant foods can be really helpful here. And, foods like tofu, nuts, seeds, avocado, for example, are a really, really good source of calories. They're much more calorie dense compared to broccoli and cauliflower and whole grains, for example, and potato, which will be much more satiating on fewer calories. So, folks listening can kind of use this information in different ways depending on what their goals are. If someone's goal was the opposite, to lose weight, then you want to lean more into those lower calorie density, higher volume, very fiber rich plant foods to sort of pack out your meals and help you feel full on less calories. So that's number one, is thinking about, are you consuming enough total calories? If you're losing weight, you're probably not. If you're low in energy, again, it could be a sign that you're not eating enough calories. And so you can lean into those different sort of more calorie dense foods. And also one sort of strategy that I use often is incorporating smoothies into my regime, and particularly on big training days. And often between meals, I'll have a smoothie that is, very calorie dense. There's lots of nuts and seeds in there, often avocado as well, plant protein, berries, frozen banana. And that's a great way to get a lot of calories in, very quickly. So those are some things that people can focus on. And then protein, this is usually something that people are quite interested in. The research that we have today is, and it's becoming much more clearer because there's a lot more people doing research on this, comparing plant and animal protein, is making it pretty clear that the most important thing is total protein intake. And the difference between animal and plant protein bioavailability, sort of absorption and the amount that your body can use to build muscle, has very likely been overstated in past years gone by. And the reason for that is that a lot of the studies looking at bioavailability were using animal models. And so they were feeding animal and plant proteins to rats and to pigs. And the main issue with this, other than the fact that a physiology point of view, those animals are not humans. The main issue is that in these studies, they were feeding raw plant proteins. So you can imagine feeding the animals raw grains or raw legumes, like a dried bean.
Hmm.
And the issue with that is that when we eat these foods, we soak them and cook them. And we do that because that makes the nutrients more bioavailable. And so more recent research from the last few years in humans, where plant proteins have been properly prepared, has been able to elucidate that there's probably only a few percent difference in terms of bioavailability between animal and plant protein. And what's more important for listeners is, are there any differences in terms of building lean muscle? And are there any differences in terms of strength? And I'm going to close this with a summary of a recommendation of what to do, but I just want to speak to this study first. There was a study out early 2021. So this is a very recent study, came out of Brazil, a group of very experienced researchers looking at protein metabolism and resistance training and lean muscle growth and strength. And they performed for the very first time a study that compared healthy adults doing resistance training, two groups, so randomized controlled trial, actually not randomized controlled trial, and I'll explain why. Two groups. One was an omnivorous group, and they were just eating, a sort of healthy omnivorous diet with whey protein. And then the other group was eating a completely plant-based vegan diet with a plant-based protein. Now, what they did, the researchers, they matched the total protein intake between both groups at 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. That's an important number to remember. The reason they did that is because the research has clearly shown if you are wanting to optimize lean muscle growth and promote strength, that's the threshold that you need to get to. Once you get to 1.6 grams per kilogram and go beyond, there's not really any extra benefit unless you are in a huge calorie deficit, unless you're someone that's eating a very small number of calories, like maybe a bodybuilder who is trying to drop a lot of weight before a show or something. But for the average person, 1.6 grams per kilogram is going to be that mark. And they took these subjects in the two groups through 12 weeks of resistance training, and they measured their lean muscle growth and strength. And the researchers hypothesized, they thought that the animal protein group would do better. Mm-hmm. And that was based on those studies that I mentioned earlier, showing differences in bioavailability. But to their surprise, there was zero differences in lean muscle growth, zero differences in strength. Both groups had big improvements in both, but no differences between the groups. And so the takeaway points from that study, and I've spoken with the lead researcher, is that people are starting to change their view of animal versus plant protein. And what seems to be most important is that you're just hitting that total protein intake of 1.6 grams per kilogram. And of course, you're doing resistance training, which is the most important thing here. That's the stimulus. That's, structure reflects function. Without that, you won't grow. So to round that out, on the protein side of things, if you are transitioning from eating an animal-based diet to plant-based, and you're someone that wants to optimize for lean muscle growth, then you want to target at least 1.6 grams per kilogram, and you want to start to understand what are the most protein-rich plant-based foods, so that you know what to eat to get there. And these are going to be, of course, most athletes will have a plant protein powder, and most omnivorous athletes will have a whey protein powder. So that's just a substitution. And then there are foods like seitan, tofu, tempeh, all the different legumes, legume pasta. These are the foods that are going to provide most of the protein in your diet and help you get there. And I often recommend that athletes use an app. I'm not sure if you use anything in particular or have. And I know a lot of people don't like to track ongoing. It's a very individual thing, but I think it can be helpful in a transition period if you are having some doubts and want to see objectively, are you getting there? Are you getting to that sort of 1.6 grams per kilogram? And there's an app called Chronometer, which you can easily put your food into over a 24-hour period, and you'll see that whether you're meeting that target or not.
Got it. Super fascinating. What about people that are working on losing weight? Maybe they've lost weight, and I'm speaking to a lot of the clients we work with who have lost a bunch of weight. They've had some like disordered eating issues in the past. So they've maybe had, periods of anorexia or even bulimia in their past. Getting to where they are now, they've hit what they think is a plateau, and they can't seem to get beyond that. Did some of their past habits, could that have carried into where they're at now? Is that affect your metabolism? I know there's been some new studies on metabolism coming out that says our metabolism doesn't drop at like menopause. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a few different things in there probably for us to unpack. I think you're talking about Herman Ponce's research recently came out. They looked at the metabolism of over 6,000 people from basically newborns up to people aged in their 90s.
Right.
And you're right. What they showed was that infants have the highest metabolic rate. And in that first 12 months, metabolism is just going crazy. And then from about year 1 to 20, our metabolism actually slows from that very initial high metabolic rate by about 3% per year up until we're about 20. And then interestingly, and this is a little different than many people thought, from 20 to 60, our metabolism basically stays exactly the same, right?
Right.
And once we get to 60, the other interesting thing is, yes, it starts to decrease, but it's much smaller than many people would predict. It's about 0.7% reduction in our metabolism per year. So if you get to mid 90s or 90 years of age, your metabolism has reduced by about 20 to 30% from when you were 50 or 40, whatever your metabolism was in your midlife. Okay, which means that per day in your 90s, you're burning about 20 to 30% less calories. So it does decrease as we get older. It's just a lot slower than people thought. And it doesn't start to decrease until we're about 60. Now, to your first question there was around plateauing. And there are, I don't want to give individual advice here because, as you said, someone with an eating disorder may have a particular trigger. And so I think individuals need to be aware of that. This is quite a sensitive topic, but broadly speaking, if you are plateauing, often this is you've essentially lost some weight, and as you lose weight, your overall amount of calories that you're burning per day do decrease, because as a human, your basal metabolic rate has reduced proportionally to the weight that you have lost. You have less metabolically active tissue that is burning energy throughout the day. So there are a couple of different strategies. If someone's at this point and they're thinking that they do want to lose weight, I mean, firstly is working out if they need to lose weight, and working with someone potentially to work out, is that right for them? Because it may not be. But you could look at the foods that you're eating and see if, going back to what I was saying earlier, are there ways for you to modify your meals to reduce some of the calorie dense foods and increase some of these more lower calorie dense foods that are high in fiber, like broccoli and cauliflower and all of your sort of non-starchy vegetables and mushrooms is something for people to look at. The other option here is to look at your training. And this is important, I think, for all of us for multiple reasons. The more muscle that you have, the more energy that your body is utilizing. And so, one of the strategies that we can do to increase, quote unquote, increase our metabolism, and particularly as we get past 60 years of age, I mentioned that our metabolism starts to slow. A strategy that we can use is performing resistance exercise consistently. Building or at least maintaining lean muscle will help reduce the rate that our metabolism declines. Okay, because muscle is a very metabolically active tissue, very energy demanding tissue. So if someone is plateauing, my advice is to look at food selection, see if they can lower the calorie density of their meals, and to look at their training. Can they do more resistance training in particular? And then the other thing that someone may want to look at, and this is very individual, is the window in which they are eating. And so for some people, for not for everyone, but time restricted eating can be helpful. And so that might sort of look like, instead of eating from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, it may be that you wake up at, let's say, 6 a.m. and you're not eating until 9 a.m. and your last meal is at 7 p.m. And in that instance that I just explained there, that means you're eating in a 10-hour sort of eating window. And my experience is that an eating window like that still allows people to have 3 meals throughout the day, but it probably, in many circumstances, results in less snacking, which does tend to help people lower their sort of overall caloric intake throughout the day.
Right. Now, I have heard you talk about eating a lot of legumes, and I do the same, like maybe proportionately more legumes than grains. Am I right about that?
Yes. So I personally, because I do try and target that higher protein intake, I lean much more into the legume food group than whole grains. And I think this is perfectly fine for someone who is adopting a sort of plant-based diet or very plant predominant diet. Whole grains do show up in the research as particularly healthful and are very good for reducing our risk of a lot of different diseases. But we also have to keep in mind that in a lot of these studies, we're looking at general public, and the addition of whole grains to their diet is different to the addition of whole grains to someone's diet who's already getting a lot of fiber, for example. So I think when it comes to your plant-based diet, adapt to it in a way that works for you to help you achieve your goals. There's no sort of set, strict rules. You have to have 4 or 5 serves of whole grains every day. You have to have 3 serves of legumes. And definitely, if someone is an athletic person, is looking to optimize their diet for strength, for lean muscle, I find dialing back a little bit on the whole grains and leaning more into the legume group will help you get there.
And I've found the same thing personally, and with many people as well. What about the people who come in and say, "Oh no, can't do beans. They give me gas."
And that's a real issue. You need to go low and slow when you're transitioning, for sure. You probably want to think about, looking at 20 to 40 to 50 gram increments at the beginning. It can be very easy to try and flip your diet upside down overnight. But you need to remember the average person in America or in Australia is consuming about 12 to 20 grams of fiber per day. And when you just flip your diet upside down and all of a sudden you're consuming 30, 40, 50 grams, it's like throwing an atomic bomb into your gut. And so, you know, an analogy for this is, let's say you haven't been training at the gym ever, and you walk in on day one and you try and pick up an 80 or 100-pound dumbbell. And, you know, you're probably going to injure yourself. You're going to be very sore. It's going to hurt, and you're not going to want to do it again. And this is very similar to, you know, if you just go from a diet that has no beans to all of a sudden trying to have 2 cups of beans a day or more. Take it easy. And if you go slow, what will happen is, we know that our microbiome does have the capacity to shift reasonably quickly and to adjust. And so, you know, the reason why legumes can be uncomfortable is because a lot of the compounds in legumes pass through the small intestine undigested. And these are different types of fiber. And the soluble fiber in particular is broken down by bacteria. We need bacteria to break it down. And when the bacteria do break it down, they actually reward us. They produce these metabolites that help keep our gut lining healthy and help decrease inflammation, for example. But when we haven't been eating a lot of these foods, we don't have enough of those bacteria to do that work. And we struggle. So as you just dial up the legumes slowly, you will promote the proliferation of those bacteria that will be able to ferment, metabolize, break down that soluble fiber. And over time, you'll be able to handle, you know, much greater serving sizes. And so, you know, just not getting too excited, going low and slow. Also thinking about, you know, some of in your transition period, certainly I think there is definitely a space for some of the slightly more processed plant-based foods, for example, that are lower in fiber. And I find working with, you know, athletes that do come back to me and say, hey, you know, these chickpeas and lentils, I'm really not feeling great. I will get them to put some of those other foods into their diet, and they do feel much better. Now, do I want plant-based burgers to be the mainstay in their diet long term? You know, probably not, but I think they do definitely play a role in sort of helping people get to a sort of position that they want to be.
Understood. Now, can you clear up the misconceptions around lectins?
Sure. One other thing I'll just quickly add to that last point. There was an interesting study that came out of Stanford University recently, and they compared a high fiber diet with a fermented food diet. Really interesting study. And long story short, they showed that unanimously fermented foods decreased inflammation and improved the diversity of the microbiome. And a diverse microbiome is associated with good health outcomes. So that was really promising in the fermented food group side of the study. On the other side of the study, the high fiber group, these subjects increased their fiber consumption from 20 grams to 40. Now, the results were really interesting. It was a very individualized response. So some people had decreased inflammation. Others had increased inflammation. And I think this is a really important sort of finding. They then went back and looked at, okay, this was sort of contrary to what their hypothesis was. They thought that, you know, across the board, increased fiber, you'll see more diversity and decreased inflammation. They went back and looked at all of the participants, their baseline microbiome diversity. So at the start of the study, before they increased their fiber, what did their microbiome look like? And what they were able to see was that those who handled the fiber really well and had decreased inflammation, they had a very diverse microbiome from the outset. those who the fiber triggered and caused inflammation and upset them had very low diversity from the beginning. And there are a number of reasons why people may have low diversity. For example, lots of antibiotic use. There are, C-sections. We know that lots of refined processed foods can lower diversity. So I think the take-home message, certainly for me from this study, and it does match up with feedback I get from the community, is that some people will do poorly if they just increase their fiber overnight and they have a sort of weak microbiome composition to begin with. And these researchers are now thinking, okay, well, the fermented food side of the study, it increased their microbiome composition across the board. So there's a hypothesis out there where if you are someone that is struggling to increase fiber, in addition to going low and slow, it may be very helpful to introduce some fermented foods in that early period and ongoing, because the benefit's likely there even once you have a healthy gut, but early on to help you promote diversity and then help you be able to handle more fiber in your diet.
This is awesome information. I did not know this. This is so helpful to so many people. Yeah.
So that's, that's essentially science that's come out in the last 2-3 months out of Stanford University. And that I want to sort of reiterate, that's the working hypothesis of the lead researcher. And they're going to now go and test that in another study. So I'd say in the next year or so, we'll have results from that. And this could start to help us piece together a bit of a protocol for people, so that when someone is reporting, hey, I'm not handling this fiber, then there is a sort of strategy that we can kind of lean into to help people better.
Oh my gosh, this is fantastic. Now, Simon, how many articles do you read in like 1 week? I can't even, you're up to date on everything. How do you do that?
I probably read each week about 7 to 10 new studies that come out. But also I'm in, quite a few different WhatsApp groups and email chains of different researchers that are also sharing their thoughts on new studies. So that's helpful to kind of stay on top of things. It would be hard on my own to do it. Lectins.
Yeah,
shall we answer that one?
Let's do it.
Okay. The mighty lectin. So there was a book that was written all about lectins and how much we should fear them. And I think there are some important principles, learnings from this for us, because this applies to many things in nutrition. The first thing that I think we need to address here is that not all science is equal. And what I mean by that is there are different forms of science, and their validity and reliability is different. And often on social media, you'll see two people presenting an opinion or an idea of something, and they're both saying studies show, backed by science, but it is false equivalence because one person is pointing to very weak evidence, for example, a study in a rat or in vitro, which is looking at cells under a microscope. And the other person is talking to human studies, be it observational or randomized controlled trials, where you look at actual health outcomes in humans that are exposed to a certain nutrient or food. And so the lectins is really interesting. The sort of hypothesis of those that are generating fear is that it affects your gut lining and that it is, a toxic kind of molecule. And all of this is from animal studies and in vitro. The really interesting thing is that there even at that level of science, let's just pretend we didn't have human studies, which we do. There is hundreds, if not thousands more studies in animals and in vitro that are showing benefit of lectins, particularly against various forms of cancer. So it does surprise me that even at that level, they have zoomed in on the very few and far between studies that show some harm. Now, as we sort of zoom out and look at human health outcome studies, if lectins were poisonous or toxic, we would expect to see both in large studies of populations and randomized controlled trials, poor outcomes when people are eating foods like legumes, for example. But we don't. We see the opposite. We see that populations eating large amounts of legumes compared to others have lower risk of type 2 diabetes, lower risk of various forms of cancer, lower risk of cardiovascular disease. We see a hallmark feature of the longest living populations in the world is regular consumption of legumes. Now, so I think something that's really important here again is that in nutrition, exposure level is very, very important. When we're talking about is something healthy or is it harmful, often it comes down to exposure, and this is quite regularly left out of headlines. If I was to say to you, is oxygen healthy or harmful? I bet you would say it's healthy.
Sure.
Okay, so I think everyone would agree that oxygen is healthy. It's health promoting for humans, and we rely on it to sustain life. But here's the deal: oxygen in air is air. It has 26% oxygen in it, right? It's not pure oxygen. If I was to give you 100% oxygen, pure oxygen, you would pass out and die if I gave you that for long enough. So oxygen can be toxic at a certain exposure level, right? This is the same thing with many parts of our diet, that a certain molecule can be very healthy at a certain exposure. It could be toxic at another. Now, these studies that those creating fear over lectins are pointing to are usually looking at animal studies where they're exposed to lectins at an exposure level that you or I would never be exposed to in a diet. And one of the main reasons that we soak and cook legumes, for example, is, as I said before, to make nutrients more bioavailable. And what happens is when you do that, you actually reduce lectins in those foods by anywhere between 70 to 90%. Right. And so, would I recommend someone goes and eats dried beans? No, I wouldn't. But if you're soaking them and you're cooking your legumes, time and time again, we show that at that level of lectins that are in those foods, there doesn't seem to be any reason to fear them at all. Those foods are consistently shown to be associated with better health outcomes, shown in clinical studies to reduce cholesterol, for example. So I think we can put that one to bed.
It's crazy that they can put out these studies of, and it essentially like tricks people into thinking that we can't eat beans because it's going to poison us, when it's really the opposite. And yeah, like eating like 3 times their body weight, like a rat in.
Yeah, we see the same thing with soy. To be fair, it's exactly the same. And that's why I said this is a bit of a principle to kind of come back to, is if someone's making a big claim and trying to scare you off of a certain food, I think it is a good skill to go, well, what level of science is that? Is that from a petri dish or an animal study? If it is, that's reason to be skeptical. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but what you want to see is that finding consistent with what we see in humans? Now, granted, if we found a situation where there was no human data at all, let's say for something there was no human data, unlike lectins and soy, which we have enormous amounts of human data showing benefits of foods containing both of those. If there was no human data, and let's say all we had was an animal study showing harm, then maybe we would take a bit of a precautionary approach and say, look, until there's further evidence, this is the best evidence we have. But when we're in a position where we have very strong, more reliable, valid evidence in humans, if we just look over that and sort of turn a blind eye to that and choose a single rat study, that is the definition of cherry picking.
Right. And also, who's sponsoring the studies? Looking at that, is that something that you find is really important?
It is important. It's the when a study is industry sponsored, it doesn't automatically mean that you just reject it on face value, which I do see quite often on social media. And the problem with that is there is industry funded studies all across the board. And if we took that position, you'd end up having to sort of, remove 60-70% of all science. And it would come down to a kind of game of anecdotes, in the absence of evidence. So I think when a study is sponsored by industry, it's a reason to be a little extra skeptical. But ultimately, you need to judge that study based on its methodology. And, an industry-sponsored study is not necessarily a bad study, but often it is performed in a way to produce a result that is favorable for them. So certainly worth having some caution.
Got it. Well, we could talk forever, but I want to get to your book before we continue. Tell us about the inspiration for writing the book. I know there are 3 parts to the book. Can you tell us a little more about it? Yeah.
So the inspiration is, this is the book that I kind of wish I had when I was making changes. I think it's incredibly hard for people to make sense of a number of issues in nutrition, and headlines and to be honest, a lot of books in the past are very selling absolutes, and yes, absolutes sell, but nutrition science, whilst it's very clear what a healthy diet looks like, there is some nuance, and unless you explore that nuance, then it can be very easy to become completely confused by the changing headlines all the time and to make sense of them. However, once you understand some of the nuance and understand these principles, you're safeguarded, you're immunized against misinformation in headlines. And so that's the goal. The goal of the book is to give people information that then stops them feeling like they're derailed. So as they go forward, because these headlines aren't going away, there's always going to be the confusion, seeded through the media and on social media. So it's about giving people the tools and skills to make sense of that and feel really confident. I feel like a number of people have lost a little bit of trust in science. They think that nobody understands what a healthy diet is, and therefore they just continue doing what they've always done. And as I said before, if we continue doing what everyone around us is doing, how can we expect a different result? We have normalized these diseases, cardiovascular disease, various types of cancer, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia, which other populations are not seeing at the same rates that we are. So it doesn't have to be that way. The book is laid out in 3 parts. Part 1 is about clearing up some of this confusion and understanding what are the sources of the confusion, from all the way from the food industry themselves and how our food environment is set up. And when we can see the sources of confusion, we can better navigate our food environment. I would love for our governments to step in and completely change and transform the food environment overnight. But we have to be realistic. That's not going to happen. And rather than the reader waiting for that to happen for 10, 20 years, I'd rather them be proactive and set themselves up for success in spite of the current food environment. Part 2 is the science. So this is more, addressing things like saturated fat and dietary cholesterol and blood pressure, and how our diet affects, atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in our arteries, and I talk about brain health in that section and longevity. There's a lot in there. And then there's a little bit on planetary health, so how our food choices affect the world around us. And then part 3 is all of the practical information. So, once you have sort of worked out what level of commitment you're looking for, what changes you want to make, what feels right for you, then there's a sort of roadmap of information to help you do that.
That's fantastic. You've got the book out. The proof is in the plants. I love that name. How'd you come up with that name? Did it just hit you or?
I wish I could remember.
Yeah.
I wrote the book over about 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
The proof is in the pudding is the saying. And, I just thought that was a neat saying. I think it was a team effort. I had a fabulous team at Penguin, a wonderful group of people that helped me pull that together. So I'm pretty sure we had a few sort of whiteboard sessions and we're thinking about names, and that one came up.
It's awesome. I love it. Then you've got the Plant Proof podcast as well, and plantproof.com is your website. Where can people get the book?
Yeah, so it's out in America November 1st. So it will be available on Amazon and all the bookstores and whatnot. You can also just go to plantproof.com/book, and there'll be links there to all the major bookstores.
Awesome. There's so many things I still want to get to, so we might have to have you back on, Simon, if you don't mind.
We can do that.
Okay, cool. So you guys go out and get this book. It's phenomenal. Simon, thank you again for being here, for taking the time. Super fun.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.